All right, so here in lesson number 15, we're going to talk about reading and writing to files. And we're going to use the system.io, which IO stands for input-output library within the .NET framework and within our application. And that's going to allow us to create directories or folders on our computer, read from files or get a list of files in that directory or folder, as well as create new files, write to files, read files, etc. And so in this case here, what we're going to do is we're going to make a very basic application where we're going to store sort of like our dialog box defaults away into a text file, and we're going to read that file and write to that file. So what I need you to do is create a new Windows application, and you'll have two labels on here. And basically the inputs are going to be a combo box control up on the top, which we've done that in the past, which gives us a drop down of items that we can choose from, or we can type in a text value here. And then the second basically control is going to be a text box, which is just going to display the value that's associated. So we're going to have like a sort of a pair names, like there's going to be the variable name and then there's going to be a value, and we're going to write that to a text file. All right, then we'll also have a save button for saving that information, and then we will have a load button here that will basically load up the information when we pick a specific variable here. It'll show the value in the dialog box. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and get everything set up to match this, and then we'll get started. Now, a couple things that are going to be important when we get started here is that when we have our application all set up, we're going to double click on the header of the form, and that will just then bring us to the form load event, which is right here. So what this means is this code block is going to be running whenever the application first starts and the form loads. Now, what we also need to do is we need to create a form closed event. Now, the way that we can do that is we go back to the designer view, and if we go over here to the lower right-hand corner where there's the properties window, if we go to this lightning bolt icon here, that will actually bring us to the events. And what's cool here is you can see all of the different events that you can actually create for a specific control. So on this form itself, what we can do is we see that there's the form load event, but then there's also a form closed. And so we actually will scroll up here, and there is a form closed event. Now, all you need to do is double click in there, and it will create a new form closed event for you. So we have the form load and the form closed. So this is just a handy way for you to actually add additional events based on different controls. We could also do this for buttons. So if I came in here to the save button, when we double click on that, that actually sort of creates automatically a click event for that. But you can also just come in here and double click inside of the click event here in the properties window, and it will create that event handler. Let's do the same thing for load. So we see the click event, double click, and there we go. So you can have a whole bunch of different events that you can subscribe to for your code. So like another good one is when the text is changed inside of a specific field, you could have that update or show a color or something like that. So there's a variety of different events that you can kind of set up here on your forms and on your controls. Now, the reason why we need this form closed event is that every time the application is closed, I'm going to actually write the information of all of the variables and values actually to the text file. So that way that's always updated. Then every time the application is started, I'm going to actually read from that text file, and then I'm going to load those up into a collection on the UI, so that way I can actually load those up and have any of that information that I previously saved appear in my application when I reopen it. All right, to get started, what we want to do is we want to create a storage collection for all of the setting variable names as well as the values associated with those. So the best way for us to do that is we're going to create a dictionary, and we've used this previously in the collections training video. So I'm going to do a data type for the keys to be string for the basically the variable names, and then the value that's going to be stored associated to that will be a string data type as well. And I'm just going to call this something like key value pairs or something like that. And then what I'm going to do is in the form load event, when the application first starts, we'll just go ahead and say key value pairs, and we will instantiate a new empty dictionary for us to go ahead and start adding things to. Now, the next step of what I want to do is I'm going to actually go up to the very top of my application here, and you'll see all of these using statements. And I really haven't explained these so far in the training that much. But essentially what these are is they're namespace sort of shortcuts or declarations. And so what that means is pretty much a lot of the different tools within the .NET framework and C# coding and programming, they're stored in different libraries, or what you'll hear called as DLLs. But the simplest way for me to explain it is libraries. And in the very beginning of the training series, I explained that there are references and these libraries that are actually referenced inside of your application. And so, to keep things organized, basically the folks at Microsoft and the creators of the .NET framework, they came up with a set of namespaces to organize different tools and libraries into sort of different kind of DLLs and have a common thinking or organizational structure. So a lot of times the core .NET framework stuff is going to be inside of what's called system. Now, what I'm going to try to do here is we're going to actually leverage the system.io. So again, input outputs, but rather than having to type the whole full system.io namespace for the library and for the classes that are in the system.io namespace, we're just going to go ahead and put system.io. Now, this isn't importing anything already because we already have the system library in here that actually contains all of the classes and information for system.io namespace. But I just wanted you to see that we're putting in a namespace reference here so that way we don't have to fully type out like directory and file and things like that. All right, so we've put that there at the top. Now, the next thing that we actually need to do here is we need to go ahead and we're going to get essentially where the My Documents folder is. And so what I want to do is I'm going to create another class level property, and we're just going to call this string. And we're going to say basically the settings file storage location. Okay. And essentially what we're going to do is that's going to be the folder where we're going to actually save the text file, where we're going to store our settings as well as load it up if that exists. And so what we need to do first is we actually, we're going to store this in the documents folder. So how do you know exactly where that My Documents folder is at? Well, the best way to do that is you can actually come in here and you can retrieve that. So let's actually get that. So we'll just say My Documents folder, and we're going to go ahead and get that. So there's system.environment, and then there's get special folder method here, or get folder path. There we go. That's the method that we want. And here's where we can actually specify a special folder that's on our computer. So what does special folder mean? It means essentially like some of those built-in folders on your computer, like program files, program data. And in this case here, we really want the My Documents folder. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm just getting wherever the My Documents folder is for this specific user that's currently using the application. And so now we're going to get that path. Now the next thing that we need to do here is we actually need to create another subfolder, so that way we're not just filling up our documents folder at the high level. We're going to create another folder here, and it's going to be basically our settings file storage folder. So what we're going to do is we're going to say settings file of storage folder location is going to equal path.combine. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to put the My Documents folder first, and then we're going to do a comma here, and then we're going to say what our folder name is. So we'll just call this lesson, and let's actually put a string here. So this is going to be lesson 15 is going to be the folder name. Now you can call this whatever you want, but I'm just using this so you can easily find it when we browse to this, and you can delete this if you want to after we're done with the training. All right, so we now have our folder here. So first we got the My Documents folder path, and then what we're doing with this path.combine is we're sort of getting the full path directory essentially for creating or seeing if our lesson 15 folder exists so we can read our settings file, and if it doesn't, we're then going to go ahead and create that folder. So how do we check whether or not that folder exists, right? Because I haven't created that before. So what if it does exist, and we need it to exist before we actually try to read a file from there? So what we're going to do is we're going to do a conditional statement. So we'll do our if statement here. And again, what we're going to be continuing to use, like everything I'm showing you here, as far as the whole path and reading and writing files, all of that is contained in this system.io namespace. And so that's why I typed this here, so that way you don't have to fully type those all out. But watch this. If I hover my IntelliSense over the path class object here, you'll see that it is system.io.path. So again, I'll hover over, and then you can see here that this class is in the system.io namespace. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to use another class that's inside of the system.io namespace called directory. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to check and see if the directory exists. So I'm going to say settings file storage location. I'm checking to see if that folder location exists. Now, if it doesn't exist, then I'm going to go ahead and create that directory. So I'll just go ahead and say directory.create directory, and we'll then say settings file storage location. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if this does not exist, I'm going to do that. So we can do that in a couple different ways. The easiest way is, like I've shown in previous videos with if statements, is that if you're trying to just basically check if something that's returned here is not equal, you can just put a exclamation at the beginning of that statement, and that basically means if directory does not exist, then do this code. Okay, so once we create the directory, then we can go ahead and see if there's a file in there, and if not, then we'll create the file. So very similar code that we've just did here, we can just say if file.exists, and then basically we can test that. Now, but I actually need to get my file itself, so I need the settings file name itself. So let's go up here and we'll just say string. So we'll say settings file name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say settings file name equals path.combine again. So very similar to what we did before. I'm going to say settings file storage location. So when I do settings file storage location, it's going to take the My Documents folder, it's going to take the Lesson 15 folder, and then that is basically this full path here, and I'm going to combine that into one total file name here, the full directory and full file name, and I'm just going to call this settingsfile.txt. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save some space here. So I'm just going to turn off my Solution Explorer and my properties for a second. So that way you're seeing the whole code a little bit easier. There we go. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just check if this file exists. So does settings file name exist? Okay. Now, the reason why I need to, again, check that the directory exists first where I'm going to place the settings file, because if I'm creating the settings file for the first time, then I essentially need to make sure that the directory where I'm going to place that settings file exists on my computer. So these are just kind of some things that the user doesn't need to see or understand, but they are things that your application needs to do. Now, in this case here, if the file does exist, then I'm going to go ahead and read that text file. So this is a little bit different. Up here, I just was basically checking to see if the directory didn't exist, and if it didn't, then I'll create that directory so I know I can save that file. Now, for the settings file itself, I'm checking to see if one exists. Now, if it doesn't, then basically I'm not going to do anything, and I'll just open up the application and there will be no settings there. Now, if the settings did exist, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to use a using statement. And this is something new. I haven't shown you this before, but the whole idea behind using statements is that they manage you disposing any kind of like streams that you're reading, like so files that you're reading into memory. It will automatically dispose that memory once you're done reading through the file. That way you don't have to call the dispose method manually at the end. So in most cases, you're not having to deal with any kind of memory management and things like that in C# programming and with the .NET framework. But essentially, sometimes you do, just to make sure you're not like packing up a bunch of stuff and keeping a bunch of things in memory, especially really large files. So here, just a simple explanation is this using statement will make sure that the stream that we're going to read or the file that we're going to read is actually going to close this out or dispose of this once it's done and we're done reading through the file. So I'm going to say stream reader, okay? And that's a class, again, all of these class, file, directory, path, and then stream reader. These are all in system.io, again, which IO stands for input output. And I'm just going to say settings reader, and I'll say equals new stream reader. Okay. And so then we basically need to put the file path that we're going to read from. And so since settings file name actually exists, that's the full file name and path and extension, we're going to go ahead and read that. Now, using statements essentially need to have a set of curly brackets. And again, we're going to do all of the whole reading of the file inside of this code block. And then once we're done reading the file, it's actually going to close that file and dispose that from memory. All right, now I'm going to put a comment in here with 2 forward slashes just so you can see how the structure of the text file is going to basically be, the settings file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say that the variable name, and then I'm going to put an equal symbol here or character, and then I'm going to put the value. Okay, and so basically we're going to have a bunch of lines in our text file that's going to be the variable name and then equals the value. And the equals character is essentially going to be the delimiter or the separator between the variable and the value. So what we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and read each line in the text file. And so the way that you loop through reading each line, because you don't know how many lines there are in the text file, so the best way to do that is a while loop. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to say while settings reader end of file, or end of stream. So see here, there's this end of stream basically property, and it will tell you whether or not the file has reached the end of stream. So as you read each line in the file, it basically moves a marker through the stream reader, and it progresses through the file. So it kind of keeps track of how many lines that you've actually read through. And so we want to keep on reading this file until we've reached the end of stream. So when the end of stream is reporting to true, then it's going to stop. Like we don't want to read anymore. So we want to keep going through this while loop as long as the end of stream is not true. Okay, so that's why I've put the exclamation at the beginning there. Okay, so again, with a while loop, we need to have curly brackets. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the line from file, and this is where we're going to actually start reading each one of the lines and the settings lines inside of that file. So I'm going to say string line from file, and I'm going to just say stream or settings reader. Okay, so again, settings reader is what we defined up here to actually, which this is the class that reads from the file itself. And so I'm going to say read line. And then basically all this does, and we don't really need to pass any parameters into that method, but it just reads each line progressively through the file, and then it returns it as a string. So you can see here it returns it as a string object, and I'm setting that line as I read each line in the file, and I'm setting it here. Now, we need to separate the variable name from the value. And so here's where we're going to use a new collection type that we haven't really shown before. We're going to create a string array. Now, what an array is it's another form of collection. It's kind of like a list. So if you remember back in the previous training videos where we talked about lists and dictionaries and things like that, arrays are a very simple form, and like they're one of the earliest forms of sort of like collections in the .NET framework and in C# programming. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this string itself and we're going to split it into an array. And so we're going to use the equal sign as a delimiter to split this entire string together, or that is together, and we're going to split it into separate parts. And it's going to split basically these two items as a collection or an array. So what I'm going to say is value, let's say actually name values array. And then what we'll do is we'll say line from file dot split. So this is a string method here that will split that string, and you can then set the character separator. So here I'm going to use single quotes to define a character, and then I'll just put equal sign here. And so what it's going to do is if it read this string, for instance here, this would be the first value in the array, this would be the second value in the array, and then there would be no longer an equal sign because it's looking as the equal as a delimiter. Okay, so now I'm going to do an if statement. If name value array dot count, and let's actually use length for arrays. You actually want to use the length property here, which gives you the integer number of basically objects or strings that are in that array. So if the count is essentially 2, right? Because basically what we're doing here is we're testing to make sure that somebody hasn't typed in something bad in the file, right? Like there shouldn't be more than one equal sign. There should be a simple variable name, the equal, and then the value. And the result of splitting that up should give us 1, 2 basically items in this array or this collection. So as long as that's true, then what we'll do is we're going to get the first string. So I'll just say the name of variable here equals name value array. And guess what? We can use an indexer here, right? So we use the square brackets and we want the first item in that array. Then we're going to say string, and we'll say value of variable equals name values array. And we'll put in an index of 1 because that's going to be the second item in the list. So again, essentially what we're doing is we're reading a line from the file, and it should be in some sort of format very similar to what I showed here in my comment line. I'm then splitting that string into 2 separate strings, and that will then get returned and input into this string array collection. I'm checking to make sure that that string array collection is only has 2 items in it. So that way I can make sure that I'm getting the first item and then the second item, and I'm just setting that equal to these variables here. Now I'm going to do another if statement, and I'm going to say if the dictionary that we created at the top here of our class, this key value pairs, if key value pairs dot contains key, then I don't want to put this in there. But if it doesn't contain the key, then I'm going to go ahead and add it to the dictionary. So here I'm going to say name a variable, right? That's the key that we want to use to look this up and find a value based on this settings key name. So then I'm going to go ahead and say here I'm going to add key value pairs dot add. So I'm adding basically the key and the value to the dictionary, and I'm going to say name a variable. That's the key name, and then the actual value there is going to be the value of the variable. Okay, I did a lot of code there, and it's a lot of different things. Now, not everything that I'm showing should be basically stuff we've done before, except for this string array and the split command. I haven't shown that previously. And then the stream reader is new, but doing the while loop here and doing these if statements, these are things that we've learned in the previous videos. Now, if you need to pause or go back and look at this section again and just kind of study exactly what's going on, feel free to do so. Really, this code here, we could almost like make this into a method. This is pretty common, right? Like you'll probably program this once, and then you might use this across 10 different applications. And just simply knowing how to read and write to a text file and then split like a delimited file, like a comma delimited file, which is, CSV files, which is pretty common still in the construction industry to read and write data from Excel and CSV files. Just knowing how to do this right here is going to take you a long way out there in writing your own programs and doing things and reading data from files. So again, if you need to, pause the video, study what's going on, and then just make sure you understand exactly what we're doing by reading the file, reading each line, and then splitting the variables, the string that we read from the file, into a variable name and a value, and then we're adding that to our dictionary here, which is key value pairs. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is essentially, once I've read through all the file here and everything is all done, this using statement is going to close. So once I've gotten to the end of the stream and this while loop discontinues or it ends because I've read the entire file, then the using statement will close. And after that, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and read each of the key value pairs and the variable names, and we're going to load those into the items field for this combo box. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for each. So again, using a bunch of tools and things that we learned in the previous videos. So for each string, and I'll just say key name in key value pairs dot keys, right? So that's the keys that we're looking up, so the variable names. And then I'm just going to do the curly brackets here for this code block of this for each loop. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say this is combo box. So combo underscore name dot items, which is the collection of items in the dropdown in that combo box, dot add, and we will say key name. All right, there we go. So if this file exists, it's going to read that file. It's going to then add all of the variable names and the values to the dictionary. Then we're going to read through all the keys in the dictionary, and we're going to make sure that they appear in the user interface for us to select from. Okay, so we don't have anything like basically right now created. So I'm going to go manually create a text file first so we can actually see if this code works. Okay, so watch this. If we actually run our application first, it will load up and there's nothing in the dropdown because there was no file, but it should have actually created that lesson 15 folder for us in my documents folder. So let's just go ahead and double check that. So I'm going to come in down here and I'm going to go to my documents folder. And there should now be this lesson 15 folder, which I do see that. And so inside of here, we're essentially going to create a new text file. So let's go ahead and see what the name of the text file was. So I call this settings file.txt. So I'm just going to copy that name here. And then what I'll do is I'll create a new text file. And I will just call it exactly that. And we'll just get rid of the extra extension there. So there we go. We now have a basic text file. So I'm going to go ahead and put some settings in here by just editing this with Notepad. So I'll just say, I don't know, let's say profile. So let's just think of some stuff that we'd actually have. And then say W12 by 14. Then material. A992. Class equals 3. What's something else? Finish equals red oxide. Okay, so that gives us a pretty good amount of stuff. Now notice that when we're looking at this file, we have new lines for each one of the variable name and value pairs, and then the equals basically separates the variable name from the value. So let's just save this file, and then we will close it. I'll minimize this folder, I'll run my code, and then now in the drop-down list, there we go. We have profile, material, class, and finish. Okay, so when I select profile, I actually want it to show what the value is. And again, the profile, the key name here is in that dictionary, right? So if I have both the key name and the value associated with profile inside this dictionary, I want to press the load button, which is going to essentially allow us to see what that is associated with whichever property that we specify or select here in the drop-down list. So let's do that code next. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'll go back to my form designer and I'm going to go to the load button. And so all I'm going to do here is I'm basically going to get the user entered, variable name. And I'm going to set that equal to text, it's actually going to be the combo box. combo_name.text field. So whatever the user has selected, I'm going to capture that. And I just want to check and make sure that it's not equal to, say, empty or the user, and just in case, let's say maybe the user hasn't selected something. So we're going to say if user entered variable name is not equal to basically an empty string, so something has been selected or filled in. Then what I'm also going to do is, let's maybe even say if user entered variable name is not equal to empty, or another way we could have actually done this is we could just say the key value pairs, so the dictionary contains key. We'll close that with an extra parentheses so that way. And again, Visual Studio is really cool in that it'll show you the start and it'll highlight the start and the end parentheses to make sure you didn't miss something. But what we need to put in here for this contains key is the user entered variable name. So what I'm doing is I'm getting basically what the user entered in the the combo box on the user interface. I'm checking to see if the dictionary key value pairs contains that key. If it does, then I'm going to go get the value from that. And I'm going to go ahead and set the text value.text field on the user interface. I'm going to set that equal to basically the key value pairs. And I'll use square brackets and I'll enter in the user entered variable name from the user interface. And it's then going to return the value from the dictionary associated with that particular key. All right, so let me go ahead and run this. And if you want to pause the video to take a look at that code, feel free. But watch this. I'm going to run the code. I'm going to select profile from the dropdown, and I'm going to press load. There's W12 by 14. Let's select class. Load, and class number 3 is there. Awesome. So this is pretty great. We have something here, and this is a real life use case. Again, we would realistically be wanting to create a dialog box and save the last entered settings in that dialog box when the user closes this application, or have settings stored in a file and basically be able to read those up. This is very similar in Tekla structures to like attribute file settings. And when you load up save settings up at the top of a dialog box, this is the same philosophy or concept here. So the next thing we want to do is, what if I type in new names, and then I actually want to type in a new variable or value for that, and I want that to then be saved in a file. So let's go ahead and do the save code next. Okay, so to do that, we need to go into our save button, basically event handler code. And again, to get to that, I can just go to the form designer, double click here on save, and there we go. We're now inside of that code block. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy the code from the load button because we're just going to tweak this. It's very similar, just with a slight bit of tweaks. We do want to get whatever the user has entered in the combo name.text box, right? Like on the UI, we want to get whatever they've typed, but we also want to get the value. So I'm just going to go ahead and say string user entered value, okay? And this is going to be equals text underscore value dot text. There we go. Okay. So essentially we're getting both the variable name as well as the value. And I still need to check whether or not the dictionary already contains that user entered variable name. If it does, we're actually going to do things differently than if it did not contain that. So watch this. If it does contain it, I'm going to actually override or modify what's in the dictionary. And if it's not, I actually need an else statement here to do things a little bit differently. So if it does already exist in the dictionary, then here's what you do. You say key value pairs, and then what you do is you actually will come in here and you will reset or modify essentially the value for this. So you just come in here and you put in the key, so user entered variable name, and you just basically are saying that the value of that key in the dictionary is going to equal the user entered value. Now, the reason why we have to do this is because that key already exists in the dictionary, and you can't add that key, the same key or a duplicate named key, into a dictionary twice. And so really this is more of a modification, a line of code, whereas if the dictionary does not contain this key and we're adding a new one, that's where we do similar to what we did below, where we say key value pairs dot add, we specify the key name, user entered variable name, and then user entered value will then get added to the dictionary. So this is a modification of an existing key and its value, and this is basically an addition of a new key. All right, so let's go ahead and see if this code actually works. Now, before I do this though, is like when you actually save or add a value, what I probably need to do is I also need to add this as a new item to the drop-down list. So if basically, if this did not exist in the dictionary, which means it also doesn't exist in the dropdown on the form here for the combo box, we need to add that to the combo box. So what I'll do probably here is if it is a add, which is what I'm seeing here, I'm just going to go ahead and say combo underscore name dot text, or no, sorry, not text, items dot add the user entered variable name. Okay, so that's adding this to the dictionary as well as adding it to the drop-down list, so that way I can select this going forward. So let's go ahead and see if this works. We come in here, we can see existing ones. So let's say that profile is here. I'm going to say load, but I'm going to change that now to something else. I'm going to say that this is W16 by 36, okay? And then I'm just going to press the save button. Now, in order to show that this is really working, let me go to class and press load, and then let me come back to profile and load, and there we go. It's 16 by 36 and not the 12 by 14 that we had there before. So that's how we were showing essentially how to modify some existing code in the dictionary. Now, let's go ahead and create a new property in here, and we'll just call this, I don't know, let's go ahead and call this clean. So the attribute name or the property name is going to be clean, or the variable name. And then we'll just go ahead and say SSPC-SP2. And then we'll go ahead and say save. Now, when we do that, if we go to the dropdown, notice that there is now a clean in here, and that was not there before. So let's go to material, press load. Let's go to clean. Let's load. And then there we go. We can see that. Now, one problem is that when I restart the application again, notice that the clean was not saved away. It wasn't written out to the settings file. So that's the last thing and the last piece of this code that we need to do, is when the form actually closes, we need to take all of the keys and values inside the dictionary and overwrite and write them to the settings file. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to go to my form closed event here and that block of code. So when the application started, we checked to see if the directory existed. We created the directory. If it didn't, we're checking to see if the settings file existed. If it did, we read those files, and we used a stream reader to do that. Well, now when the form closes, we're actually going to use a stream writer. So we're going to say stream writer, and we'll basically call this settings writer, and it equals new stream writer. And here we're going to pass that settings file name. Okay, and if you're like, hey, where did that settings file name variable come from? We declared that as a class level variable up here at the top. And basically what we did is we defined the settings file name here to be the settings file location in my documents folder in lesson 15, and we specified the file name right here. Okay, so we've got essentially a new settings writer using a stream writer, again, which this is in system.io. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do a loop. So for each, basically string, and we'll just go ahead and say key name in key value pairs dictionary dot keys. Okay, so for each key in the dictionary's key list, then what we're going to do is we're just going to essentially write basically the key name and the value to the file. So we're going to say settings writer dot write line. And you don't want to use write. You actually want to use write line. And let me explain why. So there's a write method here, and then there's a write line. The reason why I'm using write line is because then it'll put the /n for like new line. So you don't really see this inside of a text file, but technically, like watch this, let me open this up here, settings file. What actually happens is underneath the hood, there is a /n here that happens, which is sort of tells the file and text editors to basically show that this is a new line. It's kind of like when you hit enter, it goes to a new line, right? So there's this new line character that's under the hood. And so essentially when you use the write line method rather than the write method, it actually automatically does that for you. And it sort of does like a carriage return, or it hits the enter key on your keyboard. So we're just going to say write line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put key name plus, I'm going to actually string together here because I need to have the equal sign, plus we're going to go ahead and get from that key value pairs. We'll put in the key name, and this is going to get the value associated with that key name from the dictionary. Again, we've done this before. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying key name, string, I'm adding a equal sign at the end of that, and then I'm putting the value associated with that key from the dictionary at the end, and we're writing that all as a line in the text file. Okay, so really, honestly, that's it. Only a few lines of code. Again, the using statement is going to close this stream once you're done. It's also going to dispose the file and any memory associated with that. So this is the cleanest way to read and write files, is using these using statements. Otherwise, you have to actually call the close method and then dispose the file, etc. It's a couple extra lines of code, but this is the cleanest way to do it. All right, so essentially we've got this all set. Let's go ahead and try this code out and see if it works. So in the dropdown, we can load profile. There we go. We're back to 12 by 14. Let's just change this again to W16 by 36, and we'll just say save, and that should overwrite. So let's just load and make sure that that is correct. So if I go back to profile, load, good. We have 16 by 36. Now, let's change this to clean, and I'll just put in SSPC-SP2. sp2, and then we'll save that. And now that is added into my drop-down list. Okay, I'm going to now close the application, and it should execute this code in the form closed event. And let's go ahead and see if it did. If we right-click and open up our settings file, we can see here that clean is now inside of the file, and W16 by 36 is written to the profile instead of the W12 by 14 that I had there before. Now let's double check and make sure that the user interface reflects that. And there we go. There's clean, load, SSPC-SP2. So I know that this was a little bit of a longer exercise to go through, and you may need to kind of go back and watch this a few times, pause and take a look at it. But essentially, this thing that we just did here of reading and writing settings to a file, or even reading a delimited file, like if you have engineering data and things like that, this right here is one of the most common things that you'll do in programming. And so you'll use this and this concept here across many of your applications.